with every Christian, there is a theology. For every theology, there is a defense of truth.
Is there or is there not a single shred of factual historical information to substantiate what you're asserting that this is an addition to the text?
Personally, I don't know of manuscripts, but I read scholars who are specialists in that field, and they have looked at those manuscripts or seen the lack of them there.
Could you give me one name?
Written. Oh, no, I can't do that now.
Okay. So are all the popes actually believers?
Are all the popes? I don't know. Some could, some couldn't be. I don't know.
So it's possible for the vicar of Christ to be an unbeliever?
Possible, yeah.
So that's an interesting view.
Time out. This creature from the dirt defied the everlasting holy God. After that, God had said, the day that you shall eat of it, you shall surely die. And instead of dying, Thanatos, that day, he lived another day and was clothed in his nakedness by pure grace and had the consequences of a curse applied for quite some time. But the worst curse would come upon the one who seduced him, whose head would be crushed by the seed of the woman. And the punishment was too severe? What's wrong with you people? I'm serious. I mean, this is what's wrong with the Christian church today. We don't know who God is.
He doesn't have faith, he has confidence. Confidence. Confide, from the Latin, with faith.
This is Apologetics Live. To answer your questions, your host from Striving for Eternity Ministries, Andrew Rappaport.
All right. Welcome to another Apologetics Live. We're glad to have you with us. We're going to have probably an entertaining discussion tonight. Topic, at least, that we're going to start off with until those of you who want to join, is going to be on Molinism. Does Molinism lead to determinism? So if you have any friends that believe in Molinism, it would be good to send them out this link right now and tell them to join to defend their views if they can. But we're going to be joined, at least for now, we're going to be joined by Elia. Yeah, I don't know. He's going to correct it. He'll have some, way of pronouncing it. It just sounds like someone's like, see, I could say this because I can see him in the back room and he's like laughing as I'm butchering his name. It sounds more like, Eli's last name sounds more like the guys who are chanting, ah, la, 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 la. I think that's what his last name actually is. It was, they were like, what's your last name? Ah, la, 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 la. So that's, I think that's how he got his last name, but we'll find out. I can see I'm gonna get some grief in a few minutes. But I am your host, Andrew Rappaport from Striving for Eternity Ministries. And we're glad to have you. We are at Apologetics Live. We do this every Thursday night, 8 to 10 Eastern time. I see that in the house we got Prescribed Truth, the one and only, the doctor. Okay, he's prescribing truth, so he must be a doctor. That is Jamal Bandy. So maybe he'll come in and weigh in on some of these things. If you want to join the hangout and get into discussion, the best way to do that is go to apologeticslive.com. It's the one place to go. You get all the information. You'll get the topics. You'll get who's the guest speakers, guest apologists. You will get the times, and you will get the links to both watch and participate. So grab the link to watch, share it where you can. And this week, Matt will not be in, I do not believe. For folks who are been keeping up with things, and I don't know that he hasn't told me I can't say this publicly, but I guess I will. His wife is not doing well. She is going looks like she's going in for surgery, unexpected, unplanned surgery tomorrow. He was in Nashville, had to return early to come home and take care of her. So a friend of theirs had to take her to the hospital. And so be praying for the Slicks, both Matt and Mrs. Slick. And you guys could be doing that. That would be appreciated. So he won't be here. I don't know where Mr. Villa is. Tyler Villa should be coming in. He'll do his drive-by. So he usually is driving home and comes in at this time. So I'm actually going to ask him whether he's, coming in, because I don't see him in here. But I'm going to bring Mr. Eli in. Eli.
Hey, man. That's not fair. Yeah. But Matt said that my last name sounds like a Muslim war cry. That's what he said.
No, it sounds like the cry when they're getting ready to, go for prayer.
That's right. I did grow up in a Pentecostal church, so maybe that's how my name
you
was.
You were speaking in tongues.
That's right.
That's it. I understand now.
You're bad, man.
So Eli, we need to get a little lower third there so you can promote your your apologetics show that you do and your podcast. So why don't you talk about that real quick?
Yeah, I have a podcast called Revealed Apologetics and a YouTube channel.
Reveal it. What's it called?
Revealed Apologetics. That's what it's
called.
called.
That's what I'm asking you to do. Reveal it. What?
Yes. Well, I can tell you a little bit about why I don't get you. Have really weird. You have real awkward. You have really awkward jokes. I don't know when you're joking. I don't know when you're joking sometimes. I don't know what to do with that. I could explain why it's called Revealed Apologetics if that would help.
Sure, why not?
Okay. Well,
what are you revealing?
I'm revealing the fact that
it's all about.
You're gonna let me answer or what, man? Whenever you're ready, Andrew. For crying out loud. Okay. It's called Revealed Apologetics because I believe, and I'm sure you agree with this, that apologetics is something that is revealed in Scripture. It is part of the divine revelation that we are to engage in a rational defense of the faith. And as a Reformed Christian and a presuppositionalist in my apologetic methodology, I believe that the presuppositional method of apologetics is the method that is reflected in the Scriptures. And so I called it Revealed Apologetics because not only are we engaging in a discipline that the Bible has given to us, but it also reveals to us the manner and method by which we are to do it. And so I called it Revealed Apologetics for that purpose. If folks are interested, you can check me out on iTunes and YouTube. And I have a bunch of guests that are not necessarily presuppositional. I do try to cover general topics as well. But we have some interesting interviews there. I had Dr. James White. I had some classical apologists on, like Eric Hernandez, Braxton Hunter over at Trinity Radio. And the presuppositional conversations and discussions that I do have on the podcast are excellent. So people can check that out over at Revealed Apologetics. Okay.
And so you mentioned Eric Hernandez, and there's really some of what we're going to discuss tonight comes from a conversation you and I had with Eric some time ago on this show. So if folks go back to older Apologetics live shows, you're going to see the full conversation that Eli and I had with Eric on this topic of Molinism. Now, I should mention, because Ethan is asking, what happened to all my books? They
got raptured.
Yes. You actually have now more books showing in your office than I have in mine. Yes. I'm planning on moving. And so with that, we are packing everything up. And so unfortunately, the drawback to that is I didn't realize how much 8,000 books absorb the echo until I removed them. And there's nothing but, see, you guys only see these empty shelves here. There's empty shelves all around this room. And except for right there, there's my cult section hasn't been packed yet. And so, but I didn't realize how much echo comes through. But, I see, hey, give a shout out in the on YouTube. I see that we have none other than the award winning podcaster, Chris Honholz from Voice of Reason Radio. They were the recent winners of the 2019 Best Christian Podcast Episode. And so, yeah, they had, you didn't even get nominated. Wow, you've got to up your game on your show, man. But yeah, they won, and folks they could go to christianpodcastcommunity.org, and there we have the winners. We go through, there's a podcast that announces all the winners, and they're all listed there. And so Chris and his co-host Richard Story are the recipients of a $75 gift card that's coming their way by courtesy of Christian Podcast Community. So Chris is saying, I expect the delivery of my library any day now. Yeah, that wasn't what you won, Chris. You didn't win all my books. I can't afford to ship 8,000 books. So you actually, Eli, if you came over to my house right now, you go in the garage, and there is, 70, 80, I think 80 boxes right now, 85 boxes of books in my garage, just all packed up, waiting for us to sell the house and movers to come and just load them all in. I made it easy. I put them all in the garage so that they could just, the guy came in. We had a guy, moving companies come in to give estimates, and the one guy comes in and he's like, okay, he goes, I had to move a rabbi. He had something like 20,000 books. And the moving guy said he had two guys all day doing nothing but moving boxes of books. Everyone else moved furniture. They had two guys doing nothing but books all day. That's basically what he said.
You do not want to help a theologian move.
Yeah. Well, we were recording one of these when Matt Slicks had someone over helping to pack up his. So during the course of one show, we actually watched someone box up most of his books, and so yeah. So I'll give a mention. There's some folks who are on Facebook. If you go to Apologetics Live on Facebook, we will be able, there's a link there to basically give them permission so we can get your name so that we can put up your comments and not see that. Facebook user. We'd rather see something like this where we get, oh, look, it's Chris Honholz. We get to see his picture. We get to see his name. So that's the way to do it. So, Chris Honholz recently, I don't know if you know, he dresses up as Captain America, and he actually got a paid gig to be Captain America. So yeah, I mean, so it just goes to show you that some children never grow up, but there's ways that some people can get paid for it.
There's nothing wrong with not growing up.
Oh, okay. Wait, Chris, I'm gonna have to go back and check something, because Chris just said yes, bondservant. That's her name's Melissa, but her YouTube page is bondservant. Yes, bondservant. Don't remind Andrew; he'll bring it up again. What am I bringing up? Let's go back. Oh, look, bondservant for Jesus says, Chris, aren't you the Captain America cosplayer? Yes, he is. He likes to play Captain America. All right, so let's bring in. See, now this is more like theology driven, see, because we got our driver, and he's going to talk theology. How you doing, Tyler?
We are constantly putting his life in danger.
Good.
Still sunny out there in California. Tell me the weather I'm going to have next week when I come out to you.
Right now it's a little overcast, but it's like 75 degrees.
I can't wait.
I'm so jealous right now. Look at that. You bring Tyler in and you cause me to sin. I'm coveting his weather right now.
Well, hey, at least I'm just glad that Tyler doesn't have more books over his shoulder than me. At least I have a couple right there. So, Tyler doesn't have them in his car.
I actually do. I have a whole box full of in the trunk.
I knew it.
Now, so here's the thing, folks. If you're watching live, you're going to see that that Tyler is going to move about 4 or 5 feet, and then he's going to stop. He'll sit there for 20 minutes and he'll move another 4 or 5 feet. That's called LA traffic.
Yep.
Only rivaled by New York traffic.
No. It is.
That's about to start happening. I'm on a fronted road, so I'm going to get on the freeway. The freeway here in about a minute and a half, and that's going to be true.
And that's where we get to hear the Freewayed Thinker. So why don't we real quick give a plug for your podcast and the ministry you're with?
Yeah, so I do the Freed Thinker podcast. You can find it at freedthinkerpodcast.blogspot.com. I do full-length episodes, scripted episodes. That's where I go through some various topics and some papers that I've written and some things that are fully scripted. I have Freed Bite episodes, which are basically fully scripted but short, 10 to 15-minute episodes. And then I have my Freed Way Thinker episodes, which are basically me just winging it off the cuff, reflecting on something that I had read or someone I've been talking to or something while I'm driving. I thought I've redeemed my drive time, and so I record. It's hands free, so I'm being safe, but I can record while I drive. So.
All right. So tonight's topic that we selected is on Molinism. Now, I have to admit, I've always struggled with Molinism and modalism. I always get stuck with those two words. It was really funny because I was at Living Waters doing a. They were asking me a question. They asked me, the question was on one of what is modalism, and I ended up going into Molinism. I have such a hard time with those two, but
you have trouble spelling it too. In the text, you spelled Molianism. I thought we were discussing something completely different.
Well, actually, I don't know. I that was autocorrect then. But Tyler solved me of this because Tyler told me how to remember this term, Molinism, and now see, I'll never forget because hands on the wheel there, sir. No, not over your eyes. You see, the real. Oh, that's right. You're not moving. I'm sorry. It's LA.
I'm not barely. I'm going 5 miles an hour.
But because anyone that watches that's friends with Tyler on Facebook, they get to see that he has a problem in his backyard. He has, I don't know, gophers or moles or whatever they are, but he's been trying to eradicate them. And so really it's just, I think of the problems of Tyler trying to get rid of moles in his backyard and Molinism in his theology, so we got that solved now. So
yeah, it's all settled.
That's such a dad joke.
Yeah, you would understand that then, Eli.
Yes.
You got the young ones.
Once you go over 35, your jokes are no longer funny. At least that's my experience.
So, well,
you could also think of it as there's no possible word where mole is bad. So that works too.
So here's the thing. Let me give a brief overview of Molinism, and then until folks come in, I see John is in. John will let me know in the chat if he's got a specific question or if he wants to jump in. But I want to give an overview first of what Molinism is, and then after that, you guys can add where you think I've left things out. And then what I want to do is kind of give some arguments. I want to give some of my arguments, Eli, some of yours, but Tyler, you've been working on this the most and have been coming up with some newer stuff, and so I want to give some time for you to jump in. So let me just start with this as a quick overview. Molinism, is started by a Roman Catholic. I forget his name is something Molin, whatever.
Louis de Molina.
Molina, that's it. So basically, I think what I noticed the most is that what a lot of it that gets people into Molinism is really it's typically philosophers versus theologians, guys who get into philosophy versus theology, and we all know Eric Hernandez. We've Eli, you and I've had the discussion here with him, but he actually would be very much thinking that philosophy is a higher study than theology. I disagree with them. I've had that debate. But guys who are into philosophy, I think, seem to be enamored with Molinism. The other thing that I notice with it is it seems to be, now, I'm trying to say this carefully because Eli, you and I were trying to be real careful with this on the show we had with Eric. They wouldn't say that they're all anti-Calvinists. They wouldn't say that they're all Arminian, but it sure seems that way. It seems like the big thing that they're trying to do is answer the question of God's sovereignty and human free will. And the way that they go about doing this is to argue that there's this counterfactual knowledge that God would have where he knows all of the real things that happen, past, present, future. He also knows all things that could happen. And he knows the outcomes of every choice that we would make. And what they would argue is that God, in his infinite knowledge, had looked at all of the possible worlds with people of their own free choice. They have the free choice to make decisions, absolutely free. And God looks at all of those different worlds with every free choice that was made and selected the one that we're in now. And therefore, the choices that we make are completely free will. And it's not predestination, because that seems to be the big thing they're against. They seem to be very much against predestination, and they seem to define that really as determinism, right? That God determines everything. And so now I want you guys will give a more technical definition, I'm sure. I want to give the overview, so go for it. Which one of you guys wants to start?
Well, I just a caveat real quick. I don't think any Molinist would deny predestination. Remember, anyone who's an Orthodox Christian will hold to predestination since the term is in the scriptures. We'd have to hash out how they understand predestination. But just getting back to like kind of a general definition of Molinism,
well, let's just be clear. They disagree with the definition of predestination. They think that what Calvinists typically they'll say that what Calvinists believe of predestination is that God forces everything, that determinism.
They would have issue with the Reformed understanding of predestination, and they would have predestination couched within the context of their theological and philosophical framework. So we all adhere to the term since it's biblical. I think the difference is going to be in how we understand that term. It's like the debates over sovereignty. An Arminian believes God is sovereign, but they don't mean the same thing we mean as Reformed Christians when we say that God is sovereign. So we want to be careful not to, a lot of within popular debates, the Calvinist will say to the Arminian or to the Molinist or the guy who holds to some form of libertarian freedom, "Oh, you guys don't believe that God is genuinely sovereign." Well, they do, but they don't understand sovereignty the way we would. And that's not to say that we don't think that their view is insufficient. We think there are issues with how they understand sovereignty and freedom and things like that. But they do hold to those terms. So I wouldn't say that they would reject predestination. They would just have kind of a different understanding as to how they would think that term should be used. But just in regards to the definition, I think what is helpful to understand if people get confused as to how to understand what Molinism is, I like how Kenneth Keathley set it out. Kenneth Keathley is a professor over at Southeastern Theological Seminary, and he wrote the book Salvation and Sovereignty. And he frames the definition of Molinism with like this. He says that God has three moments of his knowledge, three logical moments that can be categorized as his could knowledge, his would knowledge, and his will knowledge. God's could knowledge is his knowledge of all possibilities. That is what we would call God's natural knowledge. God's would knowledge is his knowledge of all hypotheticals and counterfactuals. Okay, and so we have God's free knowledge, his knowledge of everything that will in fact happen after he executes his decree. Okay, so his middle knowledge is the knowledge that is located between his natural knowledge, his knowledge of everything that could happen, and his free knowledge, his knowledge of everything that will happen. God's middle knowledge is located in the middle of that. And so Molinists believe that when God chooses a world to actualize, it is out of the options of his middle knowledge. Say, for example, if God desires a world in which there are libertarianly free creatures, that limits the options of the possible worlds he can create, since it would limit worlds that would be that would say like determinism would be true. So those would be out if God desires to create libertarianly free creatures within a particular world. And then he decrees, and then you have his knowledge of what will in fact happen. Would you agree with that summary, Tyler?
Yeah, I think that's right. The only caveats that I would add, I would add a couple of things, or alter a couple of things. The first one is somewhat of a Keathley's somewhat confusing for me, because that and a lot of Molinists have been starting to take that, is that that use of natural knowledge seems to be somewhat of a redefinition. Mm-hmm. Because natural knowledge was typically God's knowledge concerning himself and necessities, right? So it's God's natural knowledge, his knowledge of his nature, so to speak. So to simply go that it now becomes his knowledge of what could be, of what just logical possibilities that maybe not restricted to feasible things, already just seems to be somewhat special pleading to me. It's already making a shift away from what that term historically meant. But that's an issue with Keathley. Beyond that, the only thing that I would, and you touched on it, you said it, I would just emphasize more clearly, because it's really important you're getting to criticisms and you want to show that you do understand their position and not engage in straw man. The middle knowledge specifically, it's not factuals, right? It's not that that a certain tree does. It's specifically where it gets its teeth. Is the counterfactuals of what they call creaturely freedom, which they mean libertarian freedom, because right. The Reformed don't mean the same thing when we say creaturely freedom. We actually mean compatibilistic freedom. It's an expression of God's knowledge about what people would, according to libertarian freedom, would freely choose to do if God places them in some specific circumstance.
Right. And it's located logically prior to the decree. That's what preserves the libertarianly free aspect of it. If it's located after the decree, then some form of determinism would follow from that. So they need it to be logically located where it is in that system.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we're not getting to critiques yet, but I don't think that placing it prior to the decree helps that any. So.
Well, and this is the thing, and Tyler, I know you probably have not heard the argument that I was making with Eric when he was on the show some time ago, like probably a year or so ago, with Eli and I. But one of the things I had asked him is, you step into their worldview, right? And they say, okay, God has looked at all these possible worlds he could create. And he figures, okay, this one right here, this one's going to give me the most glory. I'm going to choose that one. And so the question I ended up asking is, can people, once that happens, can we do anything other than what we chose to do in this world?
Right.
And the reality is, he ended up saying, well, you could, but you won't. Well, if you won't, then realistically, once God has chosen a world in their worldview, in their view of Molinism, once he's chosen a worldview, then it is determinism. We will only do what we chose to do in the world that God selected. If he chose a different one, we would have done something different. And so in reality, I think the thing they try to avoid with their view of Calvinism being all about determinism with the decrees ends up leading them right into the very thing I think they're trying to run away from. Because in their once God selects a world, we can't do anything but what God selected for us to do. And therefore, it is the ultimate indeterminism, is my argument.
Yeah, I think way I agree with the direction of the argument you're making. The only thing is that I think the way that it's stated, they have a way to get out of it, right? So they because there's an ambiguity in when you say could, right? It's kind of like the Bill Clinton. It depends on what is. So if it depends on what could mean, right? So and I've been trying to think of, Eli and I talked about this. I've been trying to think of a good term to distinguish these two concepts. But the question really comes down to the difference between having the faculty to do something and then having like the actual ability or the metaphysically real possibility of doing something, right? And they really rely on the first one, having the faculty to do something, right? So let's say that God has, because this is true even on determinism. Let's say that God has determined that I'm gonna grab my steering wheel like with both hands right now. I have the capacity, the muscle and skeletal and the physic, there's the capacity to do that. Well, let's say that God hadn't determined that. Does that mean that suddenly during that point of decision, I no longer have the capacity to do it?
Right.
Well, no, of course. I mean, I always have the capacity, right? So my will, I always have the capacity, the will to choose to do other than the thing that I do. The question is whether or not I have the ability or the metaphysically real possibility to actualize and to choose to do that. It's not whether or not I have the capacity or the facility to do it. And there's an equivocation that happens on those. I mean, even in a reform view, we're not going to say, well, you don't even have the facility, like your arms stop working every time you're not determined to do a specific, like your arms are muscularly determined so that you can only do whatever specific action, but they don't have the actual facility to do any other action. Right? That would just be nonsense.
Tyler, wouldn't it be related also to the idea of the bones of Jesus? This is often brought up that there's a prophecy in which the bones of the Messiah wouldn't be broken, and that prophecy would be fulfilled with 100% certainty. But that doesn't mean that there was something special about Jesus's bones that prevented them from actually being broken. They have the ability, well, not ability, but it is possible that they could be broken in one sense, and it's not possible in another sense that they would not be broken.
And they have the facility, they have the attribute of being breakable. But it's been determined. It's not a metaphysically real possibility in the actual world. The guards had no metaphysically real possibility of actually choosing to break his bones.
Right. And when I spoke with Eric, we spoke together at Texas A&M at an apologetics thing. Matt was there as well. And we had a really good conversation after the conference where we were at our hotels and we were talking about this very thing. And Eric brought up, and it kind of became a running joke between he and I. He brought up the issue of an acorn. Now, if you have an acorn, the acorn has the capacity to grow into a tree. And that capacity is still there, even though that acorn is never actually planted. You see how that works? So we don't plant the acorn, and it never grows into a tree, but that doesn't mean it lacks the capacity to grow into a tree. And I think that's somewhat related to this issue here.
Yeah, it's actually Eric using that example, that exact analogy, that caused it. That's when I realized, like, oh, you mean something. You mean you mean something else by could. Mm-hmm. You mean that type of. You mean the capacity for something. That's not what we're talking about when we're talking about determinism. No determinist is going to say that just because God has determined that acorn will never be the oak, that therefore, like biologically, it ceases to be an acorn with the genetic capacity to become an oak. Like, Well, that would just violate the law of identity, right? That would just say the acorn isn't actually an acorn.
Right.
See, that is what I think they end up doing with their whole thing of free will, because once God selects a world, you essentially lose free will altogether, right? Because once God selects that world, even though they would say you could choose something different, you just won't. But if you won't,
and for them that's not grounded. There's no, that just it's inexplicable why that is, because nothing determines that fact on their view, right? So I normally give them, I try to give them some robust thought experiments. So I say, let's just call some choice, some trivial choice X, right? I love pralines and cream ice cream. I also really like a good coffee or latte flavored ice cream with nothing in it, right? I really like those two types of ice cream. And let's say I go into a kind of a boutique ice cream shop, really high quality, and they have both of those things. And there's nothing in my nature, there's nothing in my desires, right? Nothing determines that, right? It's a trivial, on libertarian freedom, it just becomes a trivial choice because there's no determining factor, right? So my question is, let's say God has, there's two possible worlds God could create. There's world A and there's world B. They are identical worlds in every single possible way, except at a certain time, in one of them, I pick the pralines and cream. In one of them, I pick the latte ice cream, right? They're identical worlds up to that point. Nothing has determined them. That's the only difference between those two worlds. God actualizes world A, right? Why is it then, if this is an arbitrary choice, why is it that in world A, I'm going to choose, I could choose latte, but I won't because it's world A, it's not world B. Why am I going to choose pralines and cream? The only causal difference is that God determined it to be world A and not be world B. That's the only difference in the entire causal actualizing chain up to that point where I make that decision. That's it.
And I'm gonna bring John in because he's got a question. But you can't read this, Tyler, what's showing on the screen. But Ethan says Tyler is really trying to talk with his hands while driving. Let me explain something to you. In California, that you can talk with your hands while driving because you're not actually driving. All right, let me bring John in here.
Basically, you're really just parked.
You're parked for an hour and then you move a bit. So we got John in here.
Think of it like when you're leaving like a concert or like a really crowded venue and you're just waiting for your parking lot. That's what I'm doing right now.
And that's the whole way home. I mean, that's all of LA in that.
Yep.
Oh, all right. So John's trying to show that he's out in the country there.
You're out of the bunker.
Hey. Yeah, I'm out of the bunker. Well, to be honest, my Wi-Fi is getting really cruddy right now, so I decided to go ahead and switch over to my phone. So I did I cracked open Logos, my Bible software program, typed in the word Molinism to see what my library would offer, and it was really interesting because there was a book, I guess, from a guy. And the book is called No One Like Him, and there's a chapter that's called Middle Knowledge. And I think the last guy, the name is Ferret, I think is the writer. So anyways, he mentions this. It's like, so with Molinism, God really knows the future. He knows not only what possibly could occur, but also knows what will occur. In addition, he knows what would have occurred freely if he had placed his creatures in situations that obtain in other unactualized worlds. Since God's middle knowledge is knowledge of what his creatures will do freely in a libertarian sense, in any circumstance, choosing one of those possible worlds will actually
Did we lose him?
We lost him.
I guess earlier wasn't it good either. Okay, we'll see if he comes back. Are you there, Tyler?
Yeah, I'm here. Are you guys there?
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Did you catch all that or no?
No, we lost you halfway through.
Ah.
Yeah.
Well, anyways, to make it simple, I guess there's middle knowledge, and then what the book says here that I was reading is simple knowledge. I think it is, but is that the same thing as like a natural knowledge? Like are you following me?
Yeah. You're referring to No One Like Him by John Feinberg, right? That's
yes.
It's like a beige book with a red band. Yeah, I think I'd have to see the context of the paragraph, but I think simple knowledge is referring to natural knowledge. You got to be careful because when you're talking about different views of God's knowledge, sometimes people use the simple foreknowledge view, which is a particular view in which God's predestination is based on his foreknowledge. So it depends on the context there. I would imagine he'd have to be referring to natural knowledge because the context there is Molinism. So there is a difference between natural knowledge and middle knowledge. As Tyler said before, and I think I alluded to before, that God's middle knowledge is his knowledge of counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, which exist logically prior to the divine decree. That's middle knowledge. And his natural knowledge is God's, it's kind of just his knowledge of himself, all necessities, all things that are necessary, and all possibilities. That's why some of the critiques of Molinism is that middle knowledge is an unnecessary category of God's knowledge, since God's knowledge of counterfactuals is subsumed within his natural knowledge. So there is a difference there, although some might argue it's not really useful to make another category called middle knowledge.
No, I agree. In fact, I don't even agree with Molinism, period, at all. I think it's silly for them to assume that there's more than other possible timelines or other possible worlds in the knowledge of God's omniscience. I just don't get it.
John, they need free will.
Yeah.
Well, to be fair, I mean, I think that God has knowledge of ways that other ways and other timelines the world could have been. I just don't think. I think middle knowledge is trying to shoehorn in a libertarian free view into it, which I think actually starts to violate the aseity of God, because it means that God only has this knowledge in virtue of the truth makers within an uncreated creation, and so therefore God only has this knowledge in virtue of the truth makers outside of himself, and so I think that's a problem. But like on a reform view, because the Molinists a lot of times they're gonna play, and I don't mean that they're gonna be deceptive. I think that they don't always understand other views, and so they'll say things like, "Oh well, you deny middle knowledge, so therefore you think God knows things than we think he knows." Or you can't affirm omniscience because you deny that God has exhaustive counterfactual knowledge, because they're thinking the only way God can know these things is if middle knowledge is true. And I'm just going to say, well, no, because as a determinist, God has natural knowledge of himself. He knows the fact about himself that he's sovereign, and whatever he decreed to create would be true. He knows what he does decree to create, and its truth in his decrees. And so therefore, he also knows, he knows the subjunctive, had I decreed every other possibility, then I know that would be the case.
Well,
right? So God can have exhaustive counterfactual knowledge in that subjunctive sense.
We know that in Scripture that Jesus said that he knew what would happen in Sodom and Gomorrah if Christ came to them. He knew they would have repented in sackcloth and ashes. And so he's saying something that didn't actually happen. So in that, I would say, well, he knows the real and he also knows the possible. But I think, Tyler, I agree with you. It's the issue that I see is that they're trying to get into libertarian free will to say somehow we had the ability to choose things, and yet we're working with God's sovereignty instead of just looking at what the scripture says with it.
Yeah, and there's almost like an Occam's razor. Like we get the exact same amount of omniscience out of it. We don't have to create a whole third category of God's knowledge and violate aseity and create all these other problems to do it, right? I mean, it's just a function of his natural and his free knowledge. The other thing that I would say is, and Andrew, I mean, I think you're being a little too charitable actually to the Molinist. While there are some passages that may reflect that, right? Like maybe the story, about the myth of Kayla, maybe that's a true counterfactual. I think when Jesus is saying, if I had come to Sodom and Gomorrah, or if the miracles that you have seen me done in Tyre, Sidon, all those, they would have repented and believed. I think that's just a mere hyperbole. I don't know if that's a statement of an alternate timeline. That's just it's like saying, if I had presented these same miracles to my dog, then even he would have believed, right? It's just a hyperbolic statement of how dumb are you guys?
Well, see, but this is the thing, and this is where I think we end up having to try to and put ourselves in their thinking to understand, because, and I know you do this, and I want to, encourage folks who are watching, listening, just like Tyler said, that they will often misrepresent our view. We can often misrepresent their view. There's many people who misrepresent Molinism when arguing with them, but the issue that I would say is, God can know the possible, but it's not these different parallel timelines that they would argue.
Right.
And that's where I think the distinction needs to be made, because I think God, in his infinite knowledge, could know the results of things absolutely of, choices we don't make. That doesn't mean that he's got, this is world A, world B, world C, world D, and so on, that, all the possibilities, if there's like one or the other. His knowledge is something that we can't understand. Here's a simple reality for folks who may be listening, because a lot of when we talk about Molinism, it for some people goes right over their head. We're trying to break it down simply, but the point is, whenever we speak of God, we must remember that he is a being unlike anything we understand. We learn, right? We learn through observation. We observe things, we build up that knowledge. And so there's a point where we don't know something, we observe it, now we know it. God never had that. God literally never learned a thing ever. He just knows it all. We cannot conceive of that type of knowledge where he just knows it, not through observation. The second is he's eternal. And so being outside of time, being, an infinite being is very different than you and I who are in time, and there's a progression of thinking, of thought. God doesn't have that. We cannot understand that. And I think what we have is really a couple things. One is that there's some people who are trying to understand what is impossible to understand and try to explain it. That gets us into dangerous territory. There's a point where we just have to say, that's it. We can't go further than this because God is a different being than you and I. Some people, that's not satisfying to them, and they try to go further, and that causes problems.
Right. Now, Andrew, I do think we need to be careful as well that it may be the case that there is no way to fully understand how they're reconciled. But if we push that to its limit, then anytime we find a difficulty in Scripture, we just stop and not explore it. I agree with you. I don't think that the Scriptures explains it, but I wouldn't have a problem with people trying to attempt to reconcile them. I think the problem with Molinism is that it tries to do it in a very speculative way. If I could just share one of my primary problems with Molinism, besides the philosophical issue, which is the grounding objection, which I keep hearing is not a big deal for Molinists, but when I hear them explain an answer to it, I'm not convinced. Here's my primary issue, is that the idea of middle knowledge, the idea that God has these counterfactual knowledge that's logically prior to the divine decree, is something that is not itself derived from Scripture, because the Scripture doesn't it's not answering the question that Molinists are trying to answer. And Molinists would admit this, that the Bible does not explicitly present this idea of middle knowledge. And I think it was Tyler mentioned before that there's a problem in a different context, not in this podcast here, but he mentioned that there's a problem when we come to the text with a certain philosophy so as to prove text and to find passages that are consistent with that philosophy, and then say, okay, look, it can work. I think it really becomes problematic when we take a speculative idea such as middle knowledge, and it becomes kind of this philosophy that is overlaid the Scriptures, and it becomes almost like something that affects how we interpret the Scriptures. Overall, we take this speculative idea and then we run with it and apply it to all areas that seem to be related to that topic, instead of deriving the position from an exegesis of the text. Not this issue of let's find Scriptures that are consistent with it. No, let's derive our beliefs from the soil of the Scripture itself. And I used to be a Molinist. I speak with a lot of Molinists, and I'm sure they have answers and explanations. I don't see Molinism as something that comes out of the lifeblood of the text. And that's very much consistent with the idea of why Molinism was invented to begin with. It wasn't something that was just derived from the text. It was purposely developed to respond to a position. That doesn't make it false, right? But my antennas go up when a view is created in response to something else, and then we later argue this is what the Bible is teaching.
Well, but okay, so let me give a caution with that, because most of the theology comes out of answering heresy, right?
That's fair enough.
So I know you put a little bit of a caveat, but we do have historical evidence that does bring about a lot of our theology. So,
but consider that also, and I agree with you. I don't think doctrine's derived from responding to heresy. I think clarification of doctrine, and the utilization of vocabulary that helps us clarify. For example,
are you clarifying my vocabulary with that? I just want to make sure.
Well, no, but I was saying, for example, we all believe we're all Trinitarian Christians. We believe in the Trinity. Yet the word Trinity doesn't appear in the Bible, nor do the philosophical terminology that we use to define the Trinity. Right? This distinction between being and personhood. The Bible doesn't speak in those categories. But in responding to heresy, we're not creating a theology. We're clarifying a theology whose principles are already found within the Scriptures. And we could exegete Scriptures to demonstrate that there is one God and there are these three persons who are called God. I don't think you can do the same thing with Molinism, in my estimation.
Okay, so Tyler, let's work through you now. For folks who may not know, on your podcast, The Freed Thinker, you did, I want to say, 3 episodes. At least you've done more than that, but you did 3 in a row on Molinism, answering some things. There were some interesting things that came out of that. You've done more research and study on it, but one of the things that did interest me was some questions that you raised with this. So, and I want to get your input, not because I don't know what your view is, but I want the audience to hear your view. You brought up some questions when it comes to all these worlds that God could have, and you asked the question, why didn't God choose the world where Adam and Eve never sinned? Why didn't God choose the world where, Christ never came? So that in the first one, everyone goes to heaven because there's no sin in the world. In this latter one, everyone goes to hell because there was no savior in the world. And you got some answers for things like that. And some of those, you didn't seem very satisfied with how they argue God chose the world that we're in. So maybe you could address some of that.
Yeah, well, let me start by just saying that one of the reasons why we're even talking about Molinism, well, I should actually say, but it's like 95% of the pie for reasons, is because apologists have started advancing Molinism because it's apologetically useful, right? There's utility to it specifically in how you answer something like the problem of evil, right? Because the problem of evil is going to ask, well, why didn't God create or no evil? And they're saying, oh well, because of free will, right? And so they start having to answer some of these questions. And so for the Molinist, they think it's a satisfactory answer. They think it's actually the best answer for why there is evil and suffering in the world, and it's based on freedom. And yet they don't want to become total open theists. They don't want to just become, complete anarchists, right? So they still want to try to maintain some semblance of the sovereignty of God. So Molinism is the option. So the reason we're even talking about it is because of the perceived apologetical utility. But that raises a whole bunch of questions for me. Because let me actually say, the other part of the apologetical value is it's kind of coupled with this almost.
Oh, you're breaking up.
Yeah, and am I breaking up? Better? Worse?
Yeah, you're good now.
Hello?
Yeah, better.
Okay. It's tied to, in conjunction with that view, that God desires all to be saved, right? That it's not Calvinism where God has redeemed and elect people for himself. It's God really, 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 really wants all people to be saved. And well, if God is all powerful, why couldn't he accomplish that? Right? So Molinists is going to say, well, libertarian freedom. Right? This causes a bunch of problems for me, right? Because if God is all powerful, right? If God is omnipotent, and being omnipotent means the ability to do any logically possible thing, right? God can't make a square circle, because a square circle that's not a possible thing. That's a meaningless thing, right? Because a square circle is just an incoherent. I mean, it's like asking if God can do a swivel swirl. It's not a thing. So if we say God is omnipotent, it means that he can do any logically possible thing. Well, then you can ask the question, well, why couldn't God create a world where, if Adam and Eve had libertarian freedom, then there's a logically possible world where Adam and Eve could have never chosen to sin. Right? That's a logically possible thing. I see no reason to think that's logically incoherent. So why couldn't God have just actualized that world? And the Molinists is going to come along and say, well, because of freedom, God had the power to actualize that world, but that's not a feasible world, because Adam, given that context, Adam wouldn't have ever chosen not to sin. But then at that point, they're now saying you now have to define omnipotence not as the ability to do any logically possible thing, but as the ability to do any feasible thing, right? So there may be logically possible things that are strictly logically possible, but are now unfeasible for God to do. Or else they would have to say it's a necessary fact about Adam that he would choose to sin, because then you can't say, like, if Adam just is definitionally a being that would choose to sin, would never choose to sin. Right? That just becomes a logically incoherent concept if choosing to sin is part of the definition. Well, that has a problem. Right? Who gave Adam his nature? What makes Adam Adam? Well, God fashioned Adam. So God is determining Adam's nature, and so is Adam even free? And you're back to determine him. Anyways, it creates, so Molinism, in attempt to give a simple answer for the iceberg of my objection, it just compounds problems.
And I think right there, what you mentioned with who created Adam's nature, when I had my discussion with Tim Stratton over at I keep confusing. There's the Free Thinking Ministry, and I don't want to confuse. You're the Free Thinking or Free Thinker. There we go. You're the Free Thinker. Tim Stratton, who's the Molinist, is the Free Thinking.
There's a D at the end of that. It's not the free thinker. It's the freed, because he's now.
Okay. And it's really difficult to talk about them both without confusing them. But
So you got to understand the history of his podcast. That makes very clear. He was an atheist and thought of himself as a free thinker. Now that he's a Christian, he's freed from the bondage of sin and a freed thinker. Now you'll never forget. Kind of like you won't forget the moles in the back of his house, and that he's probably still dealing with.
But what I was trying to say is that when I was having my discussion with Tim Stratton, and we got to this very point where it's God who creates the nature, but then he would push back and say, well, if God has libertarian freedom, then what prevents him from creating a being who also has libertarian libertarian freedom? We are created in his image, aren't we? And I think that's that's a mistake, I think, or a logical leap to say that because God may have libertarian freedom, that therefore it's logically possible for a derivative creature to have that sort of freedom. And I'm not sure one is in a position to make that logical leap.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a big problem. I think that's a violation of the creator-creature distinction. And it may be the case that there are certain attributes of God, such that God is personal, and God has some type of freedom that might be communicable. But the exact attribute of libertarian freedom, which I don't actually think God has libertarian freedom. I think God has limited libertarian freedom. Since God isn't free to lie, for example, his nature constrains his abilities. So there's a fundamental ontological difference between the two things, though, which is namely that we are created, right? We had to be actualized, and we are objects that God foreknows, right? So that's simply not the case of God. So a lot of the problems for Molinism arise specifically, and this is why I parked, by the way, that's why I can now stop and look. A lot of the issues arise because we are in a world that God has created, that God has actualized, that God has foreknowledge of, and that metaphysical condition is just not the same as what God is by nature. God's never been created. God's never been actualized. God is not, the object of prior knowledge of another being, right? So another problem that I raise, and I know this is kind of a shotgunning without engaging much with the joinders. Another problem is if I have libertarian freedom and I have the ability to choose X or not X. Right, praline. Remember, trivial choice: pralines and cream ice cream, or coffee latte ice cream. If I have the choice libertarianly to choose either one of those, right, and it's a real possibility for me to choose either one of those. If God actualized world A with the foreknowledge that I would freely, by libertarian choice, choose pralines and cream ice cream, that means that if it is possible for me to choose latte ice cream, right? That means it's possible for there to be categorically something that God could not know, because that just definitionally is something that God did not know. He foreknew the other, right? Which means that it is logically possible there are categorically things that God cannot know. Which is a major problem for omniscience, because what that actually means, what the entailment of that is that even if God is right, that 100% of the time that what he foreknows ends up being true, it means that every instance of choice where I could have been the instantiation of that categorical, that type of category of action that God couldn't have known, God learns at every single choice that choice isn't actualizing the opposite choice. He's basically learning that his foreknowledge is correct, right? So he can't ever know that he knows his knowledge is correct, which is a major problem for omniscience. So there's all kinds of problems, but they're rooted in the fact that we are, as creations, we are specifically a different kind of thing. So we can't just say that because God and humans, because we're made in the image of God, that therefore we have identical attributes as God, even in the communicable attributes. Knowledge is a communicable attribute, but we do not categorically have omniscience. We fundamentally have a different kind of thing, even though we have a derivative of being made in the image of God.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people just assume we're made in the image of God, and they start inserting what the image of God has to be. Well, free will. God has free will. We have free will. We're made in His image. They kind of sneak that in there when that's not necessarily appropriate, I don't think.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And I think that, the more I talk with Molinists, the more I think that the very thing they're trying to avoid, they back up into. And that's the thing I kind of find interesting with it, because to me, it seems like the big thing they want to avoid is the idea of determinism, and that's exactly where their system ultimately leads. So, Tyler, you've been doing some newer stuff with this. Anything that you I don't know if you have anything written out yet, because I know you were working on some newer stuff with it. Do you have any new articles?
I have some articles that are out on it. I a while ago had released an episode called "Metaphysics and the Failure of Molinism," and it's somewhat technical, and so I released a text of that in a series of different articles. I released them all in one day. I just put them as separate articles, and then I had been working on a little bit more robust critique of feasibility, that notion that there are logically possible things that God can't do. And so I just recently released a lengthy article on that. It's a part 12 in that series. So that's actually the most recent series on the blog.
Do you want to go into some of those details, what you've been covering in the topics?
Yeah, so it's some of that what I spoke about, the problems of saying that there are logically possible worlds that God aren't feasible for God to create. That has so many problems for me. Some of the other problems are things that arise. They're not necessary to Molinism, but they're views that lots of Molinists hold. Mostly because the two most famous Molinists, William Lane Craig and Alvin Plantinga, hold them. And so William Lane Craig offers what he considers a possible solution to what's called the problem of the unevangelized, right? So, how is God good, or how do you explain the problem that there are whole populations that we know about that never would have the opportunity to hear the gospel? Right? Are they, do they just automatically go to hell? How is that fair? How is that just? Right? A lot of people, historically have tried to answer that by saying, well, God gives them kind of the benefit of the doubt on the light that they've received, so that, are they acting faithfully in accordance with, general revelation? Are they believing in a creator God and some type of general, theistic ethic or something? That's one answer that's typically be given. But someone like William Craig comes along and says, well, maybe and he builds on planning. Maybe there's these types of persons that have an attribute so that there's no possible world that they would have ever believed, right? And they call it trans-world depravity, so that in any logically possible world that person could, in any context that person would have been placed in, they never would have believed. So God kind of stacks the deck in those areas. You know, the Mayan people, maybe all the Mayans just are trans-world depraved people. He just stacks them all there so that even if they had heard the gospel, they wouldn't have believed anyways. That's what Craig thinks is a possible answer. I think that's problematic for a lot of reasons. First, I think that's a very deficient anthropology. I don't think that that's the biblical view of how God relates to humans. I don't think we're these little static cubes that can just move around in place and time, and it's the same person, right? I don't know what it means to say that Tyler would believe in the actual world, but Tyler wouldn't believe if God had placed me in Mayan culture. Like that just to me seems like that's not me anymore. So I don't know
you wouldn't even look like you. You wouldn't even look like you since with the fact that you look the way you do.
Wouldn't act like me.
You would have different parents. You'd have different parents.
It just yeah. So I mean, I don't even know what that means to say something like that. It's almost Andrew, you're good with the cults. What's the one that has like the soul bank that God can like draw from and he puts? Is that Jehovah's Witnesses or Mormon?
Mormon.
Yeah, actually, there's several of them because actually, Rabbinic Judaism would argue that as well. But yeah, it's Mormonism is probably what you're thinking, where everyone's already has that when God created all the souls, and then he just puts them in. Now, it used to be that the people that had black skin were cursed people. They were those that rebelled against God in a previous life in heaven, and somehow that was a sign of a curse. But now I guess it's okay.
but it's this idea of like a soul bank. So like God can zap you down to whatever time and place so that you're born in a particular. So in that sense, there's a person who, as a soul, would later be this. I mean, you wouldn't even be called Tyler, so I don't even know how that would work. Your soul would be in some, conception without different parents. It's like you're right. I don't see how that's the same person in that sense. It's kind of a weird way to look at it. And, and I think also, at least when defending middle knowledge, Molinus will try to show scripture that seems to support it. I have never seen any attempt to defend what Dr. Craig is saying right there, scripturally in any way, shape, or form. Maybe I'm not as as well read in Molinism as many others, but I've never seen a biblical attempt to ground that. Are you familiar with anything, Tyler? Anyone who tried to provide a biblical defense, or is it one of those things? Well, it doesn't contradict anything in Scripture, and so therefore this is a possibility.
Sorry, I lost signal there for a minute. Sorry.
Okay. What I was saying is that
I lost that whole question.
That's okay. So what I was saying is that when Molinus tried to defend the concept of middle knowledge, at least they give an attempt to defend the idea scripturally. We disagree and we think it's a deficient defense, right? But they try to provide biblical references and exegesis and things like that. Have you read any attempted biblical defense of the notion that Dr. Craig is putting forth, namely that there are these people that regardless of where they were born, just in any possible world, they would just not believe, these trans-worldly depraved people? What would be the biblical defense? Or is it, like you say, what we shouldn't do, namely it is a philosophical position in search of a proof text?
I think it's a philosophical position in search of a proof text, and because it's not from William Lane Craig, and I've been planning came up with it, right? So, there's so many. I mean, there's problems with it. Again, it's just a deficient anthropology. There's no biblical warrant for it. But my question becomes, okay, well, because there's a seemingly infinite amount of ways someone that God could create someone who's transworld depraved, right? Because there seems to be a potentially infinite number of possible humans, right? Or at least an exceedingly large one. And so the question then becomes, well, why isn't there an equal amount of transworld righteous people, right? People who would believe in any possible context, right? That concept to me seems equally plausible. It seems equally logically coherent. I mean, it seems.
Isn't that what they hold?
I see no reason to think that there wouldn't be such persons.
Wait, isn't that what the position is, though? I always thought that there is a view there that says that the people who do believe are the people who would believe in any possible world, and the people who don't believe, perhaps they're people who wouldn't believe in any possible world.
No, I don't think that they would say that the people who believe are the ones who are that trans-world righteous.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
So there may have been a possible world where I wouldn't have believed.
Okay, so there's a difference. There's a difference between the righteous and the trans-worldly damned. So the righteous, there is a possible world in which those who are saved are not saved, and then for some people who are not saved, they might be people who would have never been saved in any possible world. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So trans-world depravity is that there's no logically possible world where these people will be saved.
Okay.
Right. So my question, I have a couple questions. Again, it's a weird anthropology, but why couldn't there be a nearly infinite number of trans righteous people, and why couldn't God populate? There's what, 7 billion people on the earth. There's been like 11 billion that have existed together. Is there not that many trans righteous people that would believe no matter what situation they were put in? Why, all God would have had to do is take this one trans-world righteous person and make that Sam. Problem solved. So there's that problem. But my real problem is that it might be the case that a trans-world depraved person isn't logically possible. Unless God is making them such like it's not possible on libertarian freedom, right? Because they would have to say that means that this person, based on their libertarian freedom, would never choose to believe in any possible world, in any possible context whatsoever. They would never choose to believe. Well, that seems to be that. Then is, remember when I said it might be the case that Adam is such a being that there's no possible world in which he would have chosen not to sin, and so that means that logically, that if he definitionally is a being that cannot choose to not sin, right? In Augustine's term, if he is definitionally something that is non posse, non peccare, not able not to sin, then it's logically possible to make him a being that would ever choose to not sin, right? Because then you're saying he's non posse, non peccare, and he's posse, non peccare, which is a logical contradiction. So they would have to say that these people are almost a different species of people, so that they are by nature something that cannot ever choose to not be sinful. But what does that sound like?
You're saying that there are.
Oh, go ahead.
if there are people,
that's total
who-
depravity. That's total depravity on Calvinism.
Right.
That just there's these whole group of people that are non posse, non peccare, and so they're not able to not sin. God has made them that way, non posse, non peccare, and that He's just in punishing them for that.
Okay.
Right, which just obliterates the objection that they have against Calvinism by us saying that the natural man cannot choose God, and it's just for God to have created that way and judge him for it.
It's the very thing that
even if they end up being right that that's a logically possible thing, end up undermining their main objection against Calvinism.
Yeah. So and folks, there's a lag between Tyler and us here. But let me. I want to put this up here. Here's a question that Humble Clay had asked.
I'm talking, but I can't hear him.
Can you hear me, Eli?
I can hear you fine.
Okay. So it's just Tyler.
Oh, there.
Okay. Here's the question that I put up. Okay. Can maybe so Tyler can't hear me. Tyler, tell Tyler you have to go out and come back in.
Tyler, can you hear me? You can't hear me either?
I can hear you, but I can't hear Andrew.
Yeah, Andrew, he can hear
me. I can't hear Andrew.
Yeah,
he can hear me, but not you.
Come back in. We found that helps.
So Tyler, Andrew's saying if you just jump out and then kind of log back in, then that might work.
All right, I'll be right back.
All right.
Yeah, we have had that problem before. We had that with you one time, and that's
well, I was upside down when I was using my iPad. Now with the laptop, it works much better.
Yeah. So I have a question up there, and when Tyler comes in, we'll ask him. It's from Humble Clay, and I'll give a shout out to folks if you want to come in and because no more shout out, but more informational. If you guys want to join and ask questions, you can go to apologeticslive.com, and there's a link to participate there. And that's how you join us and get into the discussion. We'd much rather have you come in because Humble Clay is actually asking a couple things or making some comments, and it'd be good to interact. I think everyone seems to prefer just dropping comments. So, but if you are listening not live, I'll encourage you to join us on Thursday nights, 8 to 10 Eastern time. And you can watch live, ask questions, join in. And as we're recording this, we end up turning this into a podcast as well. You can go to Apologetics Live podcast. Just on any app, search for Apologetics Live. So Tyler, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Here's
he looks like a dubbed Asian movie when he moves his lips.
I know.
Sound comes afterwards.
He's ready for some kung fu.
That's right.
So here's the question Humble Clay asks. With this view, would everyone not be damned and be damned simultaneously?
No, because there would only be one actual world.
But I think so he had a follow-up, I guess. But if there are infinite worlds, we're going to be damned in some of them.
Well, you have to remember. So these are logically possible worlds. Can't think of them as like parallel worlds or like multiverse worlds. It's just a way in modal logic to talk about the way the world could have been. They're not actually. It's not like I have like a parallel world with me in it.
Right. That's confusing for the average listener, but within the philosophical literature, possible worlds, you're just dealing with examples. Like if God did this, if he created this particular world, then that's possible. It's not like a multiverse or something like that.
Yeah. One other topic I want to address with you guys, and it's really the idea, something you said earlier, Tyler. Really, it's guys like William Lane Craig, who's probably the most known, that has influenced people with this. Now, I think we could agree that William Lane Craig is a very bright guy. He's very knowledgeable and has a lot of good things to offer. I think all of us here, we wouldn't agree completely with him, we being presuppositionalists, but we would disagree with his approach on apologetics. But I think he's got a lot of good things and a lot of good things to offer. But what I find is that you see a lot of people that because of they find him brilliant in one area, they pull that in and start following everything else that he's arguing. He's not a theologian. He's a philosopher. And I think that makes a difference.
Well, I do think he has a PhD in theology. Does he not?
Yeah, I would say he's both. He does both.
Yeah.
He leans towards philosophical theology, but
yeah, I thought his PhD was philosophy.
He's got two of them.
No, yeah. Well, let me. So a funny story. So when I went to ETS in San Diego this year, the best part of ETS was I got to go to lunch. Picture sitting at this table. It was me, Chris Date, Mike Winger, and Tim Stratton. So it was a very fun lunchtime conversation. We went to the Cheesecake across from the convention center, and when we walk in, William Lane Craig and his wife are sitting at the bar. And I'm not gonna lie. In our world, William Lane Craig's a big deal. Like a squirrel girl. I was like that. How do I look like the William Lane Craig? He's a giant in the field, whether or not I have disagreements with him. He's a brilliant man. He's a giant of the faith in our time. So, but you're right. That just because that's the case, and I think William Lane Craig is, he's a Christian, so I think he's right on a whole ton of things. But even in apologetical things, I think he's right on a lot of things. We disagree methodologically. We disagree on some soteriological issues. We disagree on, he's a Baptist. We disagree on that type of thing. But I disagree with you on that.
He's right on. But it is because of his influence that it's gone into a lot of the apologetics world. Although there are other people that are pushing it. So one of the things that I've been complaining about Monism about is the feasibility. This idea that there may be logically possible worlds that aren't feasible for God to create, and God is kind of stuck with. William Lane Craig's way to put it was he's sort of hand that's been dealt. That entails some really bad things, right? That entails that there are parts about the world that God didn't want, right? That are outside of His control, and they'll say that they want to maintain sovereignty, but they'll say, oh well, because of human freedom. Then God has to save the most that He can, but there are some of these things that are kind of featured, just kind of artifacts of that libertarian freedom that are outside of His control. I've been saying, well, if we move from that position, that maybe it's the case that this is the best of the feasible worlds, that entails. Well, maybe the best of the feasible worlds had gratuitous evil and suffering, right? Maybe the best world that God could work with libertarian freedom to get Himself the most glory, to save the most people He possibly could, maybe it's an artifact of that there are certain evils. There's no redemptive value to them. They don't work work together for the good of those who love it. Maybe they just are gratuitous. They just are because the person was free to do it, and God had there's no way that God could work it together for something good. For a long time, Molinists were saying, no, that's we affirm sovereignty, we affirm Romans 8, God works all things together for the good of those who love Him. In about 2015, Kirk McGregor came out. He's one of the most famous Molinists that people know. Came out and said, it's probably the case that there are gratuitous evils and suffering,
and that's this is the best possible world that God created, given libertarian freedom.
That's the byproduct of what the world that God wanted. He has to deal with these things. Right.
All right. So,
Yep.
I think for a lot of folks, this topic kind of goes over their head, because this is a topic, I think you guys would agree, that it takes a lot of study, a lot of research to really understand rightly. It's very easy to mischaracterize Molinists and just to argue a straw man. That's easy. What I do want folks to notice, what you're hearing from both Eli and Tyler, and hopefully me, is, not just knee-jerk reactions to what their views are, but to actually investigate, study, research, to know what it is they believe, and then be responding to what they rightly believe. A lot of people don't want to do that. A lot of people want to do the easy work of just hearing something and jumping. And we discussed that earlier with the whole idea where we see them using words that we would see different. And so you when arguing on these things, I want to encourage folks to take the time to dig into what a person's position actually is. Not what you think it is, but what it actually is, because there could be a difference there. And I do want to point out that you're hearing both, from Tyler and from Eli, that they've done that they've put the time in. And this is not one of those topics, I think, guys, you'd agree, that you just pick up and go, oh, okay, I have an answer to that. I mean, this isn't like, I was going to say a discussion on the 6 days of creation, but, Tyler hasn't concluded on that one. So, but no, I mean, and there are some easy to understand, like understanding 6 days of creation would be an easy thing. Either, some people believe there are literal 6, 24-hour days, and some don't. That doesn't take all the hoops that you have to jump through with Molinism. Molinism, I think Tyler, might have been you who said it, that there are, you mentioned Occam's razor. It's like, okay, whichever is the easiest, that's probably the right one. Molinism is not an easy position to understand, let alone explain. It takes time. But you guys agree with that?
Oh, yeah. I definitely
time to understand it. It takes study.
Yeah, and that's not, and I don't think that's a negative. I mean, even Reformed theology, it can be explained simply, but then there's a depth there that requires more work and nuance and stuff. So definitely not, it's not a negative aspect of the view, but definitely it's a reality that, yes, it's not a very simple willy-nilly, oh yeah, Molinism. It's kept me up late nights many times.
Yeah. So I don't know if you guys have more that you want to touch on. I know Tyler's probably just sitting outside his house, like, oh, he's now driving. He got bored sitting outside his house.
No, it for some reason got really choppy, and so I'm even though I have full reception, so I'm seeing it. I'm at a grocery store shopping center down the street, so I'm seeing if there's like a better place in this lot.
So, I don't, we could wrap up if you guys want. Is there more that you guys want to cover on this topic?
I could go for hours and hours on this this topic, but I mean, I think we've touched on a lot of the issues, and I have a lot of articles on it that people can reference. Okay,
so real quick, why don't you give? Are you going to be doing any? Are you planning to do some podcasts on this with the new articles, or are you just going to do the articles?
Yeah, I'm gonna release this weekend. I'm going to be recording the new episode with the latest content.
Okay, so real quick, why don't you give the blog?
And I turn blog posts into episodes.
That's exactly what everyone does, right? So,
yep.
Give the links to your website, to your podcast, and all that.
The website is freedthinkerpodcast.blogspot.com. Freedthinkerpodcast.blogspot.com. or if you join the Free Thinker group page on Facebook, I'll normally post it there. Or you can just find the Free Thinker podcast on iTunes or Stitcher or Podcaster, whatever, Pocket Cat, whatever you Androiders use, and you can subscribe there and listen and find everything there.
See, at least Tyler has one thing right. He uses a good phone. So, all right, Eli. Eli, why don't you give a shout out for where people can find you and your podcast and work you're doing?
Yeah, my podcast, as I said at the beginning, is Revealed Apologetics. You can download it on iTunes and other formats. Subscribe to the YouTube channel, Revealed Apologetics. And if you have any questions on presuppositional apologetics, apologetic methodology, or Bible questions in general, you can email me at revealedapologetics@gmail.com. All
right. And you're looking very patriotic there with your USA shirt on. That's going to come in handy. I'll let you guys know. So we have some new, or at least not new, what we got going forward for you guys on some podcasts. So the next show will not be March 5th. We'll have no show. I will be in California. Tyler and I will be getting dinner instead of doing this show. No, we do have a dinner. We'll probably plan dinner while I'm out there. Tyler and I usually get a good steak when we're together, but there will be no show on March 5th. However, March 12th, you will want to be there. We're going to be dealing with a book called Torahism. It's a new term, but basically it is answering Hebrew roots and Black Hebrew Israelites and these others, all these groups that look to put people back under the law. And that's so the book is called Torahism. Robert Solberg is the author. He's going to be joining us. So if you have people that are in the Hebrew Roots movement, you have questions about it, you're going to want to join us March 12th, 8 to 10 Eastern Time, apologeticslive.com. We'll have all the information. So you want to make sure that's 2 weeks from when we're airing this one live. We will have no show on the 5th, but on the 12th, you want to join. After that, and maybe Eli will come in with his shirt because on the following week from that, from the 12th, which would be the 19th, March 19th, we will have Dr. Anthony Silvestro on, and he wants to start us off with the topic of not only can Christians, but should Christians vote for Trump? So that'll be an interesting one, I'm sure, to hear those arguments. So if you're for or against Trump, you'll want to come in on the 19th and make your voice known. Maybe we'll do a poll and see who our listeners vote for. But with that, I don't have too much else to announce. I will say this: if you're listening live today, tomorrow, that's and Saturday, that's about the last chance you're going to get to enter into the Christian Podcast Community's theology contest. So we have a contest, a 30-pound box of books, DVDs, CDs, flash drives, over $1,000 worth of resources that we're shipping to someone. And if you go to christianpodcastcommunity.org, that is the site where we have the contest. It'll pop up in the banner, and you go to the contest and you'll be able to possibly win. But that will close down on the 29th. It's a leap year day, so that's it. You have till leap year day, and then that's it. We'll shut it down. And March 1st, I should be, even though I'll be in California, I will pick a winner and announce that at some point. So if you're watching this live or listening to this just as it drops in podcast, you only have till February 29th to enter the contest. So do that quick, Eli. Don't be delaying. I would recommend or remind people about the Israel trip, but I think it's full. I think if you didn't sign up by now, you're too late. So I think it filled up. And if not, we only have a few spots. You can still go to Israel, to 2021israeltrip.com and get on the waiting list possibly. So I think that's all the announcements that we have. I will say that we got a couple really good episodes of the Rap Report coming out starting, I believe, this Sunday. We go through a historical view of the church, looking at what is the church, what does it mean. So check that out. And I'll also recommend you go to strivingforeternity.org, look at some of the articles that we have coming out there. Check out our academy that we have offering you classes for free on YouTube. So I want to encourage you to check those out. And until next time, remember to strive to make today